In the closing years of the 10th century, Japan's capital of Heian had become a world unto itself. The sovereign ruled from behind silk curtains, invisible and divine, while real power flowed through the elegant hands of the Fujiwara clan. Noble women wielded brushes like weapons, crafting verses that could elevate or destroy reputations with a single misplaced syllable. This was a civilization obsessed with beauty and refinement. A woman's worth measured not in gold, but in the curve of her calligraphy, the choice of colors layered beneath her robes, the precise moment she allowed a strand of black hair to slip past her fan. Men competed through poetry contests, their sophistication demonstrated by tears shed over cherry blossoms, or the melancholy cry of an autumn insect. Mono no aware, the beautiful sadness that comes from recognizing life's impermanence, permeated every moment. Palace nobles understood that spring flowers would fade, that love affairs would cool, that even the most exquisite silk would eventually fray. This knowledge heightened every sensation, until ordinary moments blazed with unbearable poignancy. Buddhism had transformed Japanese spiritual life, while blending with native Shinto beliefs. Karma governed destiny. Actions in this life would determine the next. Yet reincarnation offered hope. Even the humblest servant might be reborn as an empress if her heart remained pure. Women in Heian society enjoyed remarkable freedoms. They owned property, wrote literature, and conducted romantic relationships with independence unknown in neighboring China. The practice of polygamy meant that men maintained multiple wives and countless informal liaisons, while women chose their lovers with careful consideration for both passion and political advantage. Into this world of infinite refinement and subtle cruelty, where a poorly chosen poem could end a career, a child was born who would embody every ideal of Heian beauty while suffering the consequences of extraordinary gifts. The sovereign's beloved consort, known as Kiritsubo, possessed that rare combination of physical beauty and spiritual depth that marked the truly exceptional. Her name meant Paulownia Pavilion, referring to her modest quarters in the palace. Yet her influence over the ruler's heart proved mightier than women housed in grander chambers. Other palace women watched the Paulownia consort with eyes sharp as winter wind. The Kokiden consort, whose powerful family connections had secured her the highest rank among the sovereign's wives, saw in Kiritsubo's rising favor a threat to her own son's claim to eventual succession. Jealousy at the capital was an art form, expressed through subtle slights and poisonous poetry rather than crude confrontation. When Kiritsubo announced her pregnancy, the palace hummed with speculation. Would this child possess the supernatural beauty that marked the truly blessed? Would divine favor shine upon an infant whose father ruled the realm and whose mother commanded the sovereign heart? The birth came with autumn's first frost. When the infant emerged into candle-lit chambers perfumed with rare incense, his beauty struck observers silent. Here was a child touched by heaven itself. His skin glowed like polished jade. His eyes held depths that seemed to reflect eternal mysteries. Even his birth cry carried musical qualities that made palace women weep with inexplicable emotion. Hikaru, whispered the ruler, bestowing upon his son a name meaning to shine. This child will illuminate whatever darkness he encounters. Yet even in that moment of paternal pride, shadows gathered around the newborn. Palace astrologers delivered prophecies both brilliant and ominous. This child would achieve greatness beyond measure, they declared, but his extraordinary nature would bring suffering to himself and others. His beauty would attract both love and hatred in equal measure. The sovereign faced an impossible decision. Kiritsubo, despite her personal charm, came from a family of modest influence. Her son, regardless of his obvious specialness, could never compete politically with those whose mothers commanded powerful clan support. To name Hikaru as heir apparent would invite civil war. The solution satisfied no one while protecting everyone. The ruler would remove his beloved son from succession entirely by granting him the surname of Genji, indicating royal descent but commoner status. The radiant child would become Hikaru of the Minamoto clan, neither fully noble nor completely common, blessed with divine blood, yet freed from the deadly burden of legitimate succession claims. This decision would shape every moment of the boy's extraordinary life. He would move through palace society as a figure apart, too exalted for ordinary treatment, too vulnerable for complete security. Kiritsubo received news of her son's redesignated status with characteristic grace, though her already delicate health seemed to waver further. The strain of bearing and protecting a sovereign's child while navigating palace politics had drained her spiritual reserves. She began refusing meals, claiming that food had lost all flavor. Her poetry grew increasingly melancholy, filled with images of fading flowers and departing seasons. The other palace women, sensing weakness, intensified their subtle persecution. They excluded Kiritsubo from cherry blossom viewing parties, forgot to inform her of poetry competitions, and whispered behind fans whenever she appeared. These refined cruelties slowly poisoned the atmosphere around the already fragile woman. Young Hikaru seemed to sense his mother's declining spirits. He cried only when separated from Kiritsubo, but smiled with supernatural radiance whenever she held him. The sight of mother and child together, she ethereal in her growing frailty, he luminous with infant perfection, moved even hardened palace officials to tears. The sovereign visited Kiritsubo's quarters whenever protocol permitted. These meetings, once filled with poetry and gentle laughter, now carried undertones of approaching tragedy. She spoke increasingly of cherry blossoms that bloomed magnificently before scattering on the wind, of morning glories that opened their hearts to dawn only to close forever with sunset. By Hikaru's first birthday, his mother's condition had deteriorated beyond concealment. She took to her bed permanently, her skin translucent as rice paper, her voice soft as rustling silk. Yet even in illness, she maintained exquisite manners, apologizing to servants for causing trouble and composing farewell poems of heartbreaking beauty. The ruler's grief began even before death arrived. He understood that his beloved was choosing to fade away, rather than continue fighting battles she could never win. Her gentle nature, so perfectly suited to poetry and private affection, had proven too delicate for the savage subtleties of palace life. When the end came, it arrived with the softness of falling snow. Kiritsubo simply stopped breathing during an afternoon nap, her final expression so peaceful that servants initially hesitated to disturb what seemed like ordinary sleep. The sovereign's mourning violated every protocol of royal dignity. He wept openly, composed poetry of devastating emotional power, and spoke his beloved's name in public gatherings. His grief scandalized palace officials while revealing the depth of a love that had transcended political calculation. For infant Hikaru, his mother's death marked the beginning of a life shaped by absence and longing. Too young to understand loss intellectually, he nonetheless felt the disappearance of warmth and security that only maternal presence could provide. This early experience of irreplaceable loss would mark every relationship in his life, creating a pattern of intense connection, followed by inevitable separation. The sovereign arranged for the boy's education to begin immediately, surrounding him with tutors of exceptional skill. If the child could not have a mother's care, he would receive every advantage that paternal favor could provide. Thus began the extraordinary education of a child who was neither fully noble nor completely common, a future figure whose beauty would illuminate the Heian capital while casting shadows that would follow him throughout his remarkable life. In losing his mother, the Shining One had gained both the freedom to pursue his heart's desires and the curse of never finding anyone who could completely fill the void left by her departure. The years transformed young Hikaru into everything the court astrologers had prophesied. By his 15th birthday, his radiance had ripened into something that seemed to violate natural law. Men stopped mid-conversation when he passed through corridors. Women forgot to breathe behind their fans. Even hardened warriors found themselves composing verses about moonlight on water or cherry blossoms in snow, metaphors that somehow captured the impossible luminescence of the boy who walked among them like a living dream. His education had proceeded with remarkable success. The finest masters of verse, music, painting, and philosophy competed for the privilege of instructing the sovereign's luminous son. The young prince absorbed knowledge with supernatural ease, mastering Chinese classics that confounded scholars twice his age, playing the koto with such ethereal skill that listeners wept without understanding why, and composing works that circulated through the capital like whispered prayers. His accomplishments became legendary throughout Heian society. His calligraphy possessed a flowing grace that made even mundane administrative documents appear touched by divine inspiration. When he danced at court ceremonies, his movements seemed to channel the very essence of seasonal change. Now the delicate emergence of spring, now the passionate intensity of summer, now the melancholy grace of autumn's decline. His paintings captured not merely the outward appearance of his subjects, but their inner landscapes, revealing truths that the models themselves had never recognized. Yet beneath this dazzling surface lay deeper restlessness. The absence of his mother had carved a hollow space within his spirit that no amount of accomplishment could fill. He searched constantly for something he could not name, a quality of understanding, a depth of connection, a perfect harmony of souls that remained perpetually beyond his grasp. This yearning expressed itself in compositions of such haunting resonance that even the most sophisticated court ladies found themselves moved to tears by words that spoke directly to their own unacknowledged longings. The sovereign, observing his son's growing melancholy, despite his obvious talents and social success, decided that matrimony might provide the stability and purpose that education alone could not. Political considerations demanded an alliance with the powerful minister of the left, whose daughter, Aoi, possessed impeccable breeding and considerable intelligence. The arrangement would elevate the young man's status, while securing valuable clan connections that could protect him from the jealousies his extraordinary nature inevitably aroused. The wedding ceremony unfolded with magnificent pageantry that showcased the full splendor of Heian court culture. Aoi arrived at the newly established Genji residence surrounded by elaborate processions, her 12-layered robes arranged in color combinations that spoke of autumn maples reflected in still water. Hundreds of attendants carried gifts of silk, incense, and rare books. Musicians played compositions specially commissioned for the occasion. The very air seemed perfumed with the essence of imperial favor and aristocratic approval. The bride was undeniably striking, with classical features and composed demeanor that marked the finest court breeding. Her conversation revealed extensive learning in Chinese texts and Buddhist philosophy. Her deportment embodied generations of careful training in the subtle arts that separated true nobility from mere wealth. By every conventional measure, she represented the perfect spouse for an ambitious young man seeking to establish himself in sophisticated society. Yet from their first private meeting, an invisible barrier separated husband and bride. Aoi treated her young spouse with correct politeness, but no warmth. She was 4 years his senior, already seasoned in court intrigues and social complexities that still mystified him despite his precocious intelligence. Her conversation, while elegant and learned, carried an undertone of condescension that made the prince feel like an accomplished child rather than an equal partner in life's great adventure. More troubling still, his bride seemed immune to the radiance that enchanted everyone else who encountered her husband. She acknowledged his physical perfection with the same detached appreciation she might show for a particularly fine painting or an exquisite piece of calligraphy, admiring the craftsmanship while remaining emotionally untouched by the creation itself. This indifference wounded the young man more deeply than outright hostility would have done, for it suggested that his most fundamental quality held no power over the person who was supposed to share his life. Their intimate moments, when they occurred, felt like formal ceremonies rather than expressions of tenderness or connection. Aoi fulfilled her duties with the same measured precision she applied to arranging flowers or copying sutras. She approached physical union as another social obligation to be discharged with appropriate dignity, rather than as an opportunity for spiritual communion. The prince found himself longing for something he had never experienced but somehow remembered: the unconditional affection his mother had given him during those brief early years. This marital disappointment drove him to seek elsewhere what he could not find at home. The imperial court teemed with sophisticated figures who had watched his transformation from radiant child to breathtaking young man with growing fascination. Many possessed the emotional depth and artistic sensitivity that his spouse seemed to lack. Some offered the warmth and understanding he craved. A few promised adventures that his sheltered upbringing had never permitted him to imagine. His first serious affair began almost accidentally during one of his regular visits to the imperial residence. While attending a competition celebrating the autumn moon, he became separated from his escort and wandered into a section reserved for middle-ranking court attendants. There, practicing calligraphy by lamplight in a chamber decorated with painted screens depicting scenes from classical romance, sat a figure whose grace of movement immediately captured his attention. She was called Yugao, evening faces, after the pale flowers that bloomed only at dusk and closed their petals with the coming of dawn. Her allure was of an entirely different order than his bride's classical perfection. Where Aoi impressed through flawless technique and impeccable breeding, this enchanting figure captivated through natural spontaneity and transparency. She laughed easily at his tentative jokes, spoke without calculated effect about subjects that genuinely interested her, and seemed to find genuine pleasure in simple experiences that more sophisticated figures dismissed as beneath their notice. Their romance unfolded through a series of secret meetings, arranged through elaborate networks of sympathetic servants and accomplices. The evening flower lived in a modest house in a quiet district far from the imperial residence, where rank and protocol mattered less than artistic expression and intimate connection. The building itself reflected her character, elegant in its simplicity, furnished with objects chosen for their aesthetic appeal, rather than their ability to impress visitors with the owner's wealth or status. In her chambers, the prince discovered pleasures he had never imagined possible. Here was someone who cherished him, not for his political connections or his prestigious bloodline, but for qualities she perceived in his character and spirit. She delighted in the compositions he created for her, treasured the small gifts he brought during his visits, and responded to his touch with an enthusiasm that made their physical union feel like a sacred ritual rather than a social obligation. Their conversations ranged across subjects that proper court protocol would never have permitted between unmarried members of different social ranks. They discussed their dreams, their fears, their observations about human nature, their interpretations of Buddhist teachings about the impermanence of worldly attachments. The evening flower possessed a natural wisdom that formal education had never provided, an intuitive understanding of truths that scholars often missed despite their extensive learning. Yet even this happiness carried seeds of future sorrow that neither participant was experienced enough to recognize. Her very innocence made the gentle flower vulnerable to dangers she could not perceive or defend against. Her humble origins provided no protection against the sophisticated cruelties that court figures wielded like invisible weapons. She knew nothing of the jealousies her romance had awakened among those who considered themselves more deserving of the prince's attention. The first warnings came as strange dreams that left the evening flower trembling and confused upon waking. She spoke to her beloved of a figure in magnificent robes who appeared in her sleep, speaking words of terrible eloquence that turned to ash in her mouth when she attempted to remember them in daylight. These visions grew more frequent and disturbing, accompanied by physical symptoms that no physician could explain or treat: sudden fevers, unexplained weakness, and a growing sense of dread that seemed to emanate from some source beyond ordinary human experience. The young man, still inexperienced in the deadlier forms of court intrigue, dismissed these troubles as temporary ailments that would pass with time and proper care. He consulted physicians, commissioned prayers at Buddhist temples, and even consulted Shinto priests about possible spiritual purification rituals. None of these conventional remedies provided relief, for the forces threatening his beloved operated beyond the reach of ordinary religious or medical intervention. The revelation of these otherworldly dangers came through his developing relationship with another figure whose significance in his life would prove even more profound and complex. The Fujitsubo consort had entered the imperial household several years after his mother's death, chosen specifically because her remarkable resemblance to the departed Kiritsubo provided comfort to the still grieving sovereign. This resemblance proved equally compelling to the prince, who found himself drawn to his father's newest spouse with an intensity that went beyond mere physical attraction. In her presence, he felt echoes of the maternal affection he had lost, combined with yearnings he could not acknowledge even to himself. She represented everything forbidden: his father's companion, a figure of unassailable virtue, the closest thing to his mother that he would ever encounter in this life. The imperial consort possessed all the qualities that made court figures legendary for their refinement and sophistication. Her compositions displayed both technical mastery and genuine depth. Her musical performances moved listeners to experiences of aesthetic rapture that bordered on religious revelation. Her conversation revealed learning that could engage the most accomplished scholars while maintaining the grace and sensitivity that mark truly superior breeding. More significantly, she possessed a depth of character that set her apart from the calculating opportunists who typically surrounded court life. She seemed genuinely concerned with moral and spiritual questions rather than merely social advancement. Her kindness to servants and lesser court attendants reflected an understanding of human dignity that transcended considerations of rank or status. In her, the prince glimpsed possibilities for connection that went beyond physical attraction or intellectual compatibility. The consort, for her part, recognized the dangerous nature of his attention, while being powerless to prevent her own response to his extraordinary appeal. She was not immune to the radiance that had enchanted every other figure in the imperial household. More troubling still, she perceived in his character genuine qualities that commanded both respect and affection: intelligence, sensitivity, artistic gifts, and a depth of feeling that set him apart from the calculating courtiers who typically surrounded her world. Their relationship developed through layers of unspoken understanding and carefully maintained barriers. They exchanged compositions that spoke truths too dangerous for ordinary conversation, works that could be interpreted as innocent artistic exercises by casual observers, while conveying profound messages to their intended recipients. They found excuses to be present at the same ceremonies and entertainments, stealing moments of connection amid the elaborate protocols that governed court life. These encounters took place in settings of extraordinary splendor that heightened the intensity of their forbidden attraction. During cherry blossom viewing parties, they would find themselves standing at opposite ends of the same garden pavilion, ostensibly admiring the pale pink petals drifting through spring air, while actually drinking in each other's presence. At moon viewing ceremonies, they would compose verses about the lonely radiance of autumn moonlight that really described their own isolation and longing. The works they exchanged became increasingly intimate and charged with meaning. His compositions spoke of spring rain that awakened sleeping gardens, of morning mist that revealed hidden landscapes, of fires that burned all the more brightly for being concealed. She responded with pieces about flowers that bloomed in forbidden seasons, about streams that flowed toward destinations they could never reach, about hearts that treasured secrets too precious to speak aloud. Each exchange deepened their mutual attraction, while reinforcing the impossibility of any direct expression of their feelings. They were playing with forces that could destroy not only themselves, but innocent people around them. The sovereign's affection for both his son and his consort made their betrayal all the more unthinkable. Yet the very impossibility of their situation seemed to intensify their yearning, creating a feedback loop of attraction and restraint that grew more powerful with each passing season. The situation reached a crisis during the sovereign's temporary absence from the capital on a religious retreat intended to secure divine protection for the realm. Left alone in the imperial residence with minimal supervision, the prince and consort found themselves in circumstances that broke down the careful restraints they had maintained. Security relaxed during the ruler's absence. Normal routines were disrupted. The atmosphere of enforced propriety that usually governed their interactions gave way to something more dangerous and unpredictable. The decisive moment came during an evening gathering that had been organized to entertain the court during the sovereign's absence. Wine flowed more freely than usual. The conversations became more intimate and philosophical. As the evening progressed and other participants gradually departed, the prince and consort found themselves alone in a moonlit pavilion, surrounded by the intoxicating fragrance of late-blooming flowers and the subtle music of wind chimes stirring in the night breeze. In this setting of almost otherworldly splendor, their long suppressed yearnings finally overcame their moral reservations. The compositions they had exchanged, the glances they had stolen, the careful words that had danced around truths too dangerous to speak, all of these found their culmination in a single night of union that would haunt both participants for the rest of their lives. The physical communion itself seemed to transcend ordinary human experience. Both partners felt as though they were participating in some cosmic ritual that connected them not only to each other, but to the fundamental forces that governed existence itself. Their intimacy possessed an intensity and tenderness that neither had experienced before, as if years of suppressed feeling had finally found expression in physical connection. Yet even in the midst of their union, both participants understood that they were crossing a boundary from which there could be no return. They were betraying the trust of a man who had shown them nothing but kindness and generosity. They were violating the most fundamental taboos that governed court society. They were setting in motion karmic forces that would inevitably bring suffering to themselves and others. The consequences of this single night would reverberate through both their lives for years to come. The consort, discovering herself with child several weeks later, faced the terrifying possibility that the infant might not be the sovereign's. If the timing of the birth suggested illegitimate conception, both she and the prince would face exile, disgrace, or worse. Even if the deception succeeded, she would spend the rest of her life wondering whether her child carried her beloved's blood rather than her husband's. The young man experienced for the first time the full weight of guilt that comes from betraying someone who had shown him nothing but affection and support. His father's continued kindness became a source of anguish rather than comfort. Every expression of paternal pride cut like a sword. Every gesture of trust felt like an accusation. The prince, who had believed that aesthetic perfection represented the highest human achievement, now confronted the moral complexities that his sheltered upbringing had hidden from view. Their secret remained hidden, protected by the consort's quick thinking and the assumption that any child she bore must naturally be the sovereign's. When the birth came at a time that made legitimate conception plausible, both participants felt momentary relief, yet they also understood that their moment of union had fundamentally altered their relationship with each other and with the world around them. They had tasted a form of connection that made all other relationships seem pale and insufficient, while simultaneously making any future expression of that bond impossible. Meanwhile, the evening flower's mysterious illness had worsened dramatically, despite all attempts at treatment. The strange dreams had evolved into waking visions of such terror that she could no longer sleep peacefully. She spoke of invisible presences that watched her from shadows, of voices that whispered threats in languages she could not understand, of cold winds that blew through her chambers even on the warmest summer days. Servants reported increasingly disturbing phenomena surrounding their mistress. Objects moved without explanation. Flowers withered instantly when brought into her presence. The very air in her chambers sometimes grew thick and oppressive, as if some malevolent force was slowly draining the life from everything it touched. The gentle flower herself seemed to be fading away, becoming translucent and insubstantial, like morning mist before the rising sun. The prince, torn between his guilt over the consort and his concern for his beloved, sought help from every available source. He consulted physicians trained in both Chinese and native medical traditions. He commissioned elaborate Buddhist ceremonies intended to break curses and dispel evil influences. He even secretly approached practitioners of folk magic who claimed the ability to combat otherworldly threats through ancient rituals that Orthodox religion did not acknowledge. None of these efforts provided relief, for the forces arrayed against his innocent companion operated beyond the reach of conventional medicine or Orthodox spirituality. The jealous spirit of a figure whose affection had been scorned had found in the evening flower a perfect target for its wrath, someone whose very vulnerability and innocence made her defenseless against attacks that more sophisticated victims might have recognized and countered. The identity of this vengeful presence gradually became clear through subtle signs that only someone familiar with court society could have interpreted. The dreams that tormented his beloved featured a figure whose manner of dress and speech suggested the highest levels of breeding. The otherworldly attacks intensified whenever the prince visited, as if his presence triggered renewed fury in the invisible tormentor. Most tellingly, other court figures had begun to speak in whispers about Lady Rokujo, whose recent behavior had grown increasingly erratic, and whose previous romantic involvement with the prince had ended in circumstances that left her feeling humiliated and betrayed. This aristocratic figure represented everything that court culture considered most refined and admirable. Her family connections reached back through generations of distinguished service. Her education encompassed every accomplishment that marked superior breeding. Her striking appearance, while perhaps not as immediately captivating as the evening flower's natural charm, possessed the kind of classical perfection that connoisseurs recognized as truly exceptional. More significantly, she had expected to become the prince's primary companion in the years before his matrimony. Her advanced age and sophisticated understanding of court politics seemed to qualify her for the role of unofficial consort that many accomplished men maintained alongside their formal unions. She had invested considerable time and energy in cultivating what she believed would be a relationship of mutual benefit and deep connection. The prince's sudden infatuation with the evening flower had disrupted these carefully laid plans and wounded the aristocrat's pride more deeply than any ordinary rejection could have done. Her rage, refined through years of court training into something far more dangerous than crude anger, had found expression through otherworldly channels that turned her jealousy into a literally murderous force. The final tragedy came swiftly and without warning on an evening when autumn storms lashed the capital with unusual violence. As the prince sat beside his beloved's sickbed, composing prayers for her recovery and trying to offer what comfort his presence could provide, she suddenly began speaking in a voice that was not her own, elegant, cultured, and filled with cold fury that seemed to emanate from some source beyond human experience. The words that emerged from her lips were those of a court figure of the highest rank, claiming vengeance for affection betrayed and promises broken. The voice spoke of years spent preparing for a connection that had been casually discarded, of accomplishments dismissed and feelings trampled by someone too young and inexperienced to understand their value. The elegant phrases carried centuries of refined breeding, combined with otherworldly malevolence that transformed cultural sophistication into an instrument of destruction. Before the prince could summon help or attempt any intervention, the evening flower convulsed once and lay still. Her gentle spirit, unable to withstand the assault of otherworldly fury, had simply departed her body like morning mist dissolving in sunlight. The pale blooms that had given her name would never again open their petals to welcome the dusk. For the figure who had embodied their innocent grace had become the first casualty of passions too powerful for ordinary human vessels to contain. In losing his beloved, the prince learned for the first time that his very presence could become a weapon that destroyed those he most cherished. The young man who had once believed that aesthetic perfection represented the highest human achievement now confronted the darker truths that his sheltered upbringing had concealed. Refinement could mask cruelties more terrible than any warrior's sword. Affection could become hatred with otherworldly power. Even the most innocent pleasures carried hidden dangers that could manifest in ways that violated every assumption about how the world operated. As he knelt beside the evening flower's still form, composing the farewell works that etiquette demanded, while tears fell on paper, made precious by its association with irreplaceable loss, the prince began to understand that his extraordinary gifts came with equally extraordinary responsibilities. His radiance attracted devotion, but it also awakened jealousies that could destroy innocent people. His very existence seemed to create ripples of yearning and resentment that spread outward in patterns he could neither predict nor control. The floating world of Heian refinement, he now realized, operated according to rules more complex and dangerous than the formal protocols taught in court schools. Affection and death danced together in elaborate ceremonies, where the most graceful gestures often concealed the most devastating intentions. In learning these truths, the young man who would become legend began his transformation from innocent recipient of divine gifts into someone who understood the terrible responsibilities that came with the power to inspire both devotion and destruction. The death of Yugao marked the beginning of Hikaru's deeper understanding of karma and consequence. As he performed the prescribed mourning rituals, burning incense before Buddhist altars, and commissioning sutras for her peaceful rebirth, he began to perceive patterns in his life that his youthful innocence had previously obscured. Every bond he formed seemed to bring suffering to those who opened their hearts to him. Every gift he possessed appeared to exact a price from others that he was only beginning to comprehend. His grief took forms that scandalized the imperial household. Rather than maintaining the composed dignity expected of someone of his rank, he openly wept during public ceremonies. His compositions during this period possessed a raw emotional power that made sophisticated audiences uncomfortable, for they revealed depths of genuine feeling that aristocratic culture preferred to keep hidden beneath layers of aesthetic refinement. He spoke his lost beloved's name in contexts where protocol demanded circumspect references to the departed one, violating conventions that had governed noble behavior for generations. More troubling to his allies, the young man began questioning fundamental assumptions about the society that had shaped him. In conversations with Buddhist monks, he explored concepts of renunciation and withdrawal from worldly attachments. He commissioned paintings depicting the impermanence of earthly glory, scenes of abandoned mansions being reclaimed by flowering vines and autumn grasses. His personal chambers, once decorated with objects chosen for their aesthetic perfection, now contained stark reminders of mortality. Withered flowers preserved in crystal containers, mirrors that reflected shadows rather than light. The sovereign, observing his son's transformation with growing concern, attempted to restore the young man's equilibrium through increased responsibilities and honors. He elevated Hikaru's rank, granted him additional lands and revenues, and arranged for him to participate in important ceremonial functions that would demonstrate continued imperial favor. These gestures, intended as expressions of paternal support, only deepened the recipient's sense of unworthiness and moral confusion. Meanwhile, the circumstances surrounding Yugao's death had begun generating whispers throughout Heian. Servants who had witnessed the otherworldly phenomena surrounding her final illness spoke guardedly of supernatural interventions and spiritual possessions. Physicians consulted about her mysterious symptoms, admitted their inability to explain her condition through conventional medical knowledge. Most significantly, informed observers noted the correlation between her decline and certain aristocratic figures whose previous affairs with Hikaru had ended in disappointment and resentment. Lady Rokujo herself had become a subject of fearful speculation among those sophisticated enough to interpret the subtle signs of otherworldly influence. Her behavior at public gatherings had grown increasingly erratic. She would arrive late to ceremonies and depart early without explanation. Her usually flawless appearance sometimes showed disturbing lapses: disheveled hair, incorrectly arranged robes, makeup that seemed to have been applied by trembling hands. Most unnervingly, other attendees reported feeling inexplicably cold when she passed nearby, as if her presence drew warmth from the surrounding atmosphere. These developments created dangerous undercurrents that threatened Hikaru's position within the delicate ecosystem of imperial society. The Kokiden consort, who had never forgiven his mother's elevation above her own status, seized upon his recent troubles as evidence of divine displeasure with the imperial favor he continued to receive. She began cultivating alliances with other figures who harbored resentments against his privileged position, building a coalition that could challenge his influence if circumstances provided the right opportunity. Her son, who remained the most likely heir to the throne, despite his half-brother's obvious superiority in every measurable quality, served as the focal point for these anti-Genji sentiments. Though lacking his siblings' remarkable gifts, the crown successor possessed legitimate credentials that made him attractive to those who valued stability over brilliance. The Kokiden faction began promoting the idea that the realm needed rulers chosen for their moral reliability rather than their aesthetic accomplishments. The crisis that would transform these simmering tensions into open conflict arose from an unexpected source. During a verse competition celebrating the first snow of winter, Hikaru encountered a young girl whose innocence and natural grace reminded him powerfully of his lost beloved. She was called Murasaki, after the wildflowers that bloomed on mountainsides far from human habitation. Unlike the sophisticated figures who had dominated his previous romantic involvements, this child possessed an untouched quality that seemed to promise renewal and healing. She was the niece of Fujitsubo, the imperial consort whose secret liaison with him had produced consequences that continued to complicate both their lives. This family tie created additional layers of complexity and danger, for any involvement with the girl would inevitably remind observers of the forbidden affair that had preceded it. Yet Hikaru found himself drawn to her with an intensity that overcame his rational awareness of the risks involved. The child lived in relative obscurity with her grandmother, a nun who had withdrawn from aristocratic life to pursue Buddhist meditation and charitable works. Their modest residence, located in the foothills outside the imperial city, provided an environment of simple elegance that contrasted sharply with the elaborate luxury of noble existence. Here, surrounded by natural gardens that changed with the seasons and furnished with objects chosen for their spiritual rather than material value, the young flower was receiving an education that emphasized character development over social accomplishment. Hikaru's initial visits to this sanctuary were ostensibly motivated by religious purposes. Consultations with the elderly nun about Buddhist philosophy and charitable donations to support her contemplative community. These meetings provided opportunities to observe the child in her natural environment, where her genuine responses to seasonal changes, verse, and music revealed a depth of sensitivity that sophisticated training could never produce. Unlike Yugao, whose vulnerability had made her defenseless against otherworldly attacks, this young person possessed an inner strength that seemed to derive from her spiritual upbringing and natural resilience. She responded to Hikaru's attention with curiosity rather than immediate infatuation, asking questions about aristocratic life that revealed both intelligence and independence of thought. Her compositions, while technically imperfect by sophisticated standards, displayed an authenticity that made more polished works seem artificial by comparison. The bond developed slowly and carefully, with Hikaru exercising restraint that his previous romantic adventures had lacked. He understood that the child's innocence represented something precious that hasty actions could destroy. More significantly, his experience with Yugao had taught him that his very presence could endanger those who cared for him. He approached this new association with awareness of responsibilities he had previously ignored. Yet even this cautious approach could not prevent the implications of his interest from creating new dangers. Imperial observers who tracked his movements noted his frequent absences from ceremonial functions and his visits to areas outside the city. The Kokiden faction interpreted these behaviors as evidence of disloyalty to the sovereign and disrespect for established traditions. They began constructing narratives that portrayed Hikaru as someone whose personal indulgences took precedence over public responsibilities. The situation reached a tipping point when the elderly nun, who had been serving as the child's guardian and protector, died suddenly during a particularly harsh winter. Her death left the young flower vulnerable to relatives who saw her potential association with Hikaru as an opportunity for social advancement. These figures lacked the wisdom and spiritual insight that had previously protected the girl from exploitation and manipulation. Rather than allow her to fall into circumstances that would corrupt her natural innocence, Hikaru made a decision that would scandalize conventional opinion while reflecting his growing understanding of moral responsibility. He arranged for the child to be brought to his residence as his ward, creating a household arrangement that defied traditional categories while providing her with protection and proper education. This decision proved to be the catalyst that his enemies had been seeking. The Kokiden consort and her allies interpreted Hikaru's establishment of an irregular household as evidence of moral corruption that disqualified him from continued imperial favor. They launched a carefully orchestrated campaign of criticism that questioned not only his personal conduct, but his fitness for the responsibilities that his royal blood traditionally entailed. Their attacks took forms that were difficult to counter directly. Rather than making explicit accusations that could be refuted through evidence or testimony, they promoted subtle insinuations that created atmospheres of doubt and suspicion. They suggested that Hikaru's recent bereavements had affected his judgment. They wondered aloud whether someone so obviously susceptible to romantic entanglements could be trusted with important state responsibilities. They expressed concern that his irregular lifestyle might offend the deities, whose favor the realm depended upon for prosperity and protection. These criticisms gained credibility from Hikaru's own behavior during this period. His grief over Yugao's death had made him careless about maintaining the public image that aristocratic life demanded. His withdrawal from certain social functions had created opportunities for his enemies to characterize him as unreliable and self-indulgent. Most damaging, his obvious devotion to his new ward provided apparent evidence for claims that he prioritized personal desires over public duties. The sovereign found himself in an impossible position, torn between paternal affection and necessity. He recognized the injustice of the attacks on his son, understanding that they reflected jealousy and calculation rather than genuine moral concern. Yet he also understood that Hikaru's continued presence at the imperial household had become a destabilizing factor that threatened the harmony necessary for effective governance. The solution, when it came, satisfied no one while protecting everyone involved. Rather than face formal accusations that could lead to disgrace or worse punishment, Hikaru would voluntarily withdraw from the city for a period of reflection and spiritual purification. This banishment would be presented as a religious retreat, motivated by pious intentions rather than factional pressure, preserving his dignity while removing him from the immediate sphere of aristocratic intrigue. The decision to depart was made during the cherry blossom season, when the city's gardens displayed their most heartbreaking splendor. As Hikaru prepared for his journey to the coastal province of Suma, where he would establish a temporary residence far from the machinations that had made his position untenable, he found himself experiencing emotions that combined anticipation with profound sadness. He was leaving behind not only the world that had shaped him, but the people whose lives had become intertwined with his own. His secret affair with Fujitsubo would necessarily be severed, at least in its direct forms. His developing bond with his ward would be interrupted just as it was beginning to provide the emotional stability he had sought throughout his adult life. Most painfully, he was abandoning Yugao's grave, whose memory had become central to his understanding of both affection and loss. Yet the prospect of departure also offered possibilities that continued aristocratic life could never provide. Away from the elaborate protocols and subtle cruelties that characterized noble existence, he might discover forms of authenticity that sophisticated society made impossible. Separated from the pressures that had shaped his identity since childhood, he could explore aspects of his character that had remained undeveloped beneath layers of social expectation. The journey to Suma began at dawn, on a morning when late spring rain created veils of mist that softened the harsh edges of departure. Hikaru's entourage was deliberately modest, consisting of a few faithful retainers and the essential possessions necessary for maintaining dignity in reduced circumstances. This simplicity itself represented a form of rebellion against the elaborate displays that usually accompanied aristocratic travel. As Heian disappeared behind curtains of rain and distance, Hikaru felt sensations he had never experienced before. For the first time in his life, he was moving beyond the boundaries of the world that had defined his existence. The landscape through which he traveled, rural villages, mountain passes, agricultural communities, represented aspects of his realm that he had known only through literary descriptions and artistic representations. The people he encountered during this journey responded to his presence with mixtures of awe and curiosity that differed fundamentally from aristocratic reactions to his appearance. Farmers and merchants who glimpsed him at rest saw not a figure whose favor might advance their interests, but a manifestation of refinement and grace that briefly transformed their ordinary experiences into encounters with transcendent possibility. These interactions provided Hikaru with insights into forms of human authenticity that noble life had obscured. The spontaneous responses of people unschooled in sophisticated dissimulation revealed emotional truths that elaborate etiquette usually concealed. Children who stared openly at his remarkable appearance, elderly villagers who offered simple hospitality without calculation, young people who composed crude but heartfelt verses in response to his presence. All of these encounters contributed to his growing understanding of human nature, freed from the distortions of ambition and social competition. The coastal province of Suma, where he established his temporary residence, possessed a wild splendor that contrasted dramatically with the cultivated elegance of the imperial city. Here, waves crashed against rocky shores with primordial force that made human achievements seem fragile and temporary. Winds carried salt spray and the cries of seabirds rather than the perfumes and musical performances that characterized aristocratic life. The very air possessed a clarity and intensity that urban atmospheres, filtered through countless human activities, could never achieve. His dwelling, while comfortable and appropriately furnished for someone of his rank, reflected the simplified aesthetic that banishment had imposed upon his circumstances. Rooms that in Heian would have been filled with elaborate decorations now contained only essential objects chosen for their functional value and natural appeal. Gardens that at the imperial household would have displayed perfect artificial arrangements here showcased the raw processes of seasonal change and natural growth. In this environment, separated from the social pressures and factional intrigues that had dominated his previous existence, Hikaru began experiencing forms of solitude and reflection that sophisticated society rarely permitted. His days followed rhythms determined by natural cycles rather than ceremonial obligations. He woke with sunrise, spent hours in meditation and study, composed works that expressed personal truth rather than social expectations, and fell asleep to the sound of waves rather than the distant music of noble entertainments. This simplified existence revealed aspects of his character that aristocratic life had either suppressed or distorted. away from audiences who expected constant displays of brilliance and sophistication. He discovered quieter satisfactions in contemplating seasonal changes, practicing calligraphy for its own sake rather than for social effect, and exploring philosophical questions without concern for their implications. Most significantly, the physical separation from his previous romantic entanglements allowed him to examine those affairs with clarity that emotional proximity had made impossible. He began to understand how his extraordinary gifts had created expectations and dependencies that ultimately proved destructive to the very people he had sought to cherish. Yugao's death, his forbidden liaison with Fujitsubo, his complex feelings toward his young ward, all of these bonds appeared different when viewed from the perspective of banishment and reflection. The spiritual dimensions of his retreat became increasingly important as months passed. Buddhist teachings about the impermanence of worldly attachments, which had previously seemed like abstract philosophical concepts, now acquired concrete meaning through his daily experiences of separation and simplification. Meditation practices that aristocratic life had reduced to formal observances became genuine instruments for exploring consciousness and developing equanimity. Yet even in isolation, his ties to the larger world could not be completely severed. Letters arrived regularly from Heian, bringing news of developments, seasonal celebrations, and personal messages from those whose lives remained intertwined with his own. These communications served as reminders of responsibilities and bonds that physical distance could not eliminate. Most treasured among these correspondences were letters from his ward, whose education was continuing under the supervision of trusted retainers. Her compositions revealed a developing sophistication that combined technical skill with the natural sensitivity he had first recognized in her. More importantly, they demonstrated her continued affection and loyalty, despite the disruption his departure had caused in her life. Fujitsubo also maintained contact through carefully coded messages that expressed their continued bond, while acknowledging the impossibility of their situation. Her letters spoke of seasonal changes that mirrored emotional states, of verse competitions that lacked their former vitality, of ceremonies that felt empty without certain participants. These communications conveyed profound longing while maintaining the discretion that their circumstances demanded. Through these ties, Hikaru learned of developments that would eventually affect his own future. The coalition that had forced his banishment was beginning to fragment as its members pursued conflicting ambitions. The crown's successor, despite his legitimate claim to inheritance, was proving less capable of inspiring loyalty and confidence than his supporters had anticipated. Most significantly, the sovereign himself was aging and increasingly concerned about the long-term stability of arrangements that had separated him from his most gifted son. As his second year away progressed, subtle indications began suggesting that his eventual return to Heian was not only possible, but desired by influential figures who had come to appreciate his absence as a loss rather than a relief. The very qualities that had made him dangerous to certain interests, his remarkable abilities, his capacity to inspire both devotion and jealousy, his embodiment of aesthetic ideals, were now being recognized as assets that the realm could not afford to permanently sacrifice. The formal invitation to return came during the autumn of his third year in Suma, delivered by emissaries who brought not only the sovereign's explicit authorization, but expressions of longing from throughout the imperial household. The landscape had shifted sufficiently to make his restoration not only safe, but advantageous to the same figures who had previously opposed him. His enemies had either died, lost influence, or discovered that their interests were better served by accommodation than continued hostility. Yet the figure who prepared to return to Heian differed fundamentally from the young man who had departed in scandal and confusion 3 years earlier. Banishment had stripped away illusions about the nature of power, affection, and responsibility that his privileged upbringing had never challenged. He understood now that his extraordinary gifts came with obligations that extended beyond personal satisfaction to encompass the welfare of everyone whose lives his actions might affect. The journey back to the imperial city reversed the route he had taken during his departure. But the traveler who made this return passage carried within himself transformations that made familiar landscapes appear entirely new. The same villages, mountain passes, and rural communities that had once represented escape from sophistication now served as reminders of authentic human values that aristocratic life tended to obscure but should never entirely abandon. His return to Heian was orchestrated as a celebration rather than a rehabilitation, with ceremonies and festivities that demonstrated his complete restoration to imperial favor. Yet Hikaru himself approached these honors with the detachment that isolation had taught him, understanding that fortune was as changeable as weather, and that true security could only be found in spiritual development and genuine human bonds. The reunion with his ward, now transformed by 3 years of education and maturation into a young woman of remarkable grace and intelligence, provided the deepest satisfaction of his return. She had preserved not only her natural innocence, but a developed sophistication that enhanced rather than replaced her authentic responses to experience. In her presence, he glimpsed possibilities for partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than the calculations and manipulations that had characterized his previous romantic adventures. The figure who had left Heian as a brilliant but ultimately selfish young aristocrat returned as someone capable of understanding that true refinement involved not the display of personal gifts, but their application to purposes larger than individual gratification. His banishment had transformed him from someone who inspired admiration into one who might actually deserve it. The return from Suma marked the beginning of the Shining One's golden age. Yet even this triumph carried within it the seeds of future sorrow. His restoration to imperial favor exceeded every expectation, as if the sovereign sought to compensate for the injustice of his banishment through unprecedented displays of paternal generosity. New titles, expanded estates, and ceremonial honors flowed toward him like spring water rushing down mountain slopes. The very nobles who had conspired against him now competed to demonstrate their renewed loyalty and admiration. His residence became the acknowledged center of cultural refinement in Heian. Poets, musicians, painters, and scholars gathered in his halls like moths drawn to flame, creating an atmosphere of artistic achievement that surpassed even the imperial household itself. The gardens he commissioned combined natural splendor with human artistry in ways that redefined what was possible. Each seasonal transformation revealed new harmonies between architecture and landscape, between cultivated refinement and wild growth. Yet beneath this surface, magnificence lay currents of melancholy that his years of reflection had both deepened and refined. Success, he discovered, could be as isolating as failure. The very accomplishments that elevated him above his contemporaries also separated him from genuine human connection. Admirers saw in him a living embodiment of perfection, rather than a person capable of ordinary friendship or simple companionship. His reunion with the violet flower had initially provided hope for a different kind of fulfillment. The child he had left behind had matured into a young woman whose intelligence and sensitivity seemed to promise the perfect partnership he had sought throughout his adult life. Her education, carefully supervised during his absence, had produced someone who could match his intellectual accomplishments while retaining the natural authenticity that sophisticated training often destroyed. Their household arrangements reflected his determination to create something unprecedented in aristocratic society, a union based on mutual respect rather than conventional hierarchies. The purple blossom was neither wife nor concubine in the traditional sense, but something entirely new, a companion whose opinion he valued, whose judgment he trusted, whose presence provided emotional stability without the calculations that characterized most noble alliances. For several years, this arrangement seemed to fulfill both participants' deepest needs. The Violet Lady bloomed under his guidance and attention, developing into one of the most accomplished women of her generation. Her brushwork achieved a flowing excellence that court connoisseurs ranked among the finest they had ever seen. Her musical performances moved listeners to tears through their combination of technical mastery and emotional depth. Most significantly, her compositions revealed an understanding of human nature that formal education could never teach. Their daily interactions created an atmosphere of intimacy and intellectual stimulation that the radiant prince had never experienced before. Morning conversations over tea became opportunities for exploring philosophical questions that interested them both. Evening music sessions allowed them to communicate through harmonies that words could not express. Seasonal ceremonies in their private gardens provided shared experiences that deepened their appreciation for both cultivated refinement and natural processes. Yet even this seemingly perfect arrangement could not escape the fundamental tensions that governed his existence. His extraordinary nature, which made him capable of inspiring such profound devotion, also made him incapable of limiting his attachments to a single person. The very sensitivity that allowed him to appreciate his companion's unique qualities also made him responsive to allure wherever he encountered it. The crisis that would ultimately destroy their happiness began with what seemed like innocent social obligations. His elevated position required participation in numerous ceremonies, entertainments, and cultural gatherings, where he encountered other accomplished women whose attractions he found increasingly difficult to resist. These interactions, initially casual and apparently harmless, gradually developed into emotional entanglements that duplicated patterns from his youth. One such involvement centered on a young woman known for her exceptional skill in traditional dance. Her performances at seasonal festivals had made her famous throughout the imperial city, not only for her technical abilities, but for her capacity to embody the emotional essence of the pieces she interpreted. When she danced the role of the abandoned beloved in classical court entertainments, audiences wept openly at her portrayal of heartbreak and longing. Their affair began through collaboration. He composed music specifically for her performances, while she interpreted his works with understanding that seemed to penetrate directly to their emotional core. These professional interactions gradually became personal meetings, then secret assignations that rekindled the passionate intensity he had experienced in his youth, but thought he had outgrown through development and domestic stability. Another entanglement involved a sophisticated woman whose intellectual accomplishments rivaled those of the most learned court scholars. Her knowledge of Chinese philosophy and Buddhist doctrine provided conversation that challenged even his remarkable education. In her presence, he rediscovered the excitement of intellectual discovery that had marked his student years. Their bond developed through exchanges of scholarly commentary and philosophical speculation that gradually acquired emotional undertones neither participant had initially intended. Each of these involvements seemed to offer something that his life with the Violet Lady lacked: the excitement of pursuit, the pleasure of conquest, the variety that his restless nature craved. Yet each also diminished his capacity for appreciating what he already possessed. The very act of seeking fulfillment elsewhere implied that his current circumstances were somehow inadequate. a judgment that inevitably affected his behavior toward the woman who had devoted her life to creating their shared happiness. The purple blossom, with the heightened sensitivity that profound attachment develops, began perceiving these changes before he himself fully acknowledged them. His attention, once focused entirely on their mutual activities and interests, now seemed divided among concerns she could not share. His presence, formerly a source of constant comfort and stimulation, became intermittent and distracted. Most painfully, his compositions and music, which had once expressed their shared experiences and emotions, began reflecting themes and imagery that excluded her entirely. The realization of his infidelities came not through dramatic discovery, but through the gradual accumulation of small observations that created an undeniable pattern. Late arrivals explained by vague references to ceremonial obligations, perfumes clinging to his robes that differed from any she used. Most tellingly, changes in his creative output that suggested new sources of inspiration and emotional engagement. Rather than confronting him directly with accusations that would only create painful scenes and accomplish nothing positive, the violet flower chose a response that reflected both her aristocratic training and her genuine wisdom. She began withdrawing gradually from their shared activities, claiming minor illnesses that required rest and solitude. Her own creative work increasingly focused on themes of impermanence and detachment that Buddhist philosophy offered as remedies for worldly suffering. This withdrawal, intended as a dignified alternative to emotional confrontation, produced effects that neither participant had anticipated. The shining prince, suddenly deprived of the constant companionship he had taken for granted, began recognizing how essential his companion's presence had become to his daily happiness. Her absence made him aware of emotional needs that his other involvements could not satisfy, despite their immediate attractions and pleasures. Yet his recognition of these needs came too late to prevent the psychological damage that his infidelities had already caused. The Purple Lady's trust, once given completely and without reservation, could not be restored through mere protestations of renewed devotion. The perfect intimacy they had shared had been contaminated by knowledge that made innocent happiness impossible to recover. Her response to this situation revealed the depth of character that his original attraction to her had intuited but never fully appreciated. Rather than attempting to compete with his other women through jealous displays or seductive manipulations, she turned increasingly toward practices that promised liberation from the suffering that worldly attachments inevitably produced. She began spending long hours in contemplation and prayer, seeking in religious teachings the peace that human relationships had failed to provide. Her verse during this period achieved a transcendent quality that expressed profound understanding of impermanence and the futility of clinging to changeable circumstances. Her brushwork took on qualities of ethereal refinement that seemed to capture the process of her spirit's gradual withdrawal from earthly concerns. These developments initially appeared to represent positive personal growth that might eventually restore harmony to their household. The Radiant One encouraged her interests, commissioning renowned monks to serve as her instructors and providing resources for charitable activities that gave concrete expression to her ideals. He interpreted her increasing serenity as evidence of wisdom, rather than recognizing it as a symptom of profound disappointment and gradual withdrawal from life itself. The truth of her condition became apparent only when her physical health began deteriorating in ways that no conventional treatment could address. She lost interest in food, claiming that earthly nourishment no longer appealed to someone preparing for transcendence. Her sleep became troubled by dreams that she described as visions of other realms, where suffering souls sought liberation from karmic bonds that chained them to cycles of rebirth and disappointment. Court physicians consulted about her symptoms could find no organic causes for her decline. Her pulse remained steady, her breathing clear, her physical functions apparently normal. Yet she was obviously fading away, like morning mist dissolving in sunlight, as if the essential force that animated her body was gradually departing for destinations that medical knowledge could not comprehend. The luminous prince, faced with the approaching loss of the person whose presence had provided his life's greatest stability and happiness, finally understood the true consequences of his romantic adventures. His pursuit of variety and excitement had destroyed the one bond capable of providing genuine fulfillment. His inability to appreciate what he possessed while seeking what he lacked had set in motion a process of withdrawal that no amount of belated attention or renewed devotion could reverse. He abandoned his other involvements entirely, devoting himself to caring for the violet flower with an intensity that recalled their early years together. He composed music specifically for her entertainment, arranged for performances by the finest court musicians, and created garden displays that captured the seasonal splendor she had always cherished. These efforts provided momentary pleasure that briefly rekindled their former intimacy, but could not address the deeper wounds that his betrayals had inflicted. Their final conversations took place during the autumn of her 37th year, when maple leaves outside their chambers displayed the fiery magnificence that had always marked their favorite season. She spoke with calm acceptance of her approaching departure, describing death not as tragedy, but as liberation from attachments that had caused more suffering than joy. Her words carried the authority of someone who had achieved genuine insight through experiencing the full range of human emotions, from ecstatic happiness to profound disillusionment. She died on a night when the first winter snow fell softly on their gardens, covering the autumn's faded glory with pristine whiteness that symbolized the purity her spirit had achieved through suffering and renunciation. Her final verse, found beside her pillow, expressed gratitude for their years together, while acknowledging that true peace could only be found beyond the realm of changeable human attachments. The loss of the purple blossom marked the beginning of the Shining One's final transformation. The man who had believed that cultural accomplishment represented life's highest achievement now understood that refinement itself could become a source of delusion if pursued without wisdom. The paramour who had sought to possess every form of attractiveness he encountered now recognized that genuine fulfillment required the very constancy and contentment that his restless nature had made impossible. His grief took forms that bewildered those who expected conventional responses to bereavement. Rather than seeking comfort in new relationships or distractions, he withdrew from social activities that had once provided his greatest pleasures. Verse competitions, musical performances, and creative gatherings lost their appeal for someone who now understood that all cultural achievements were ultimately shadows of deeper realities that art could point toward, but never fully capture. The gardens he had created with such pride now seemed like elaborate monuments to impermanence. Each carefully planned vista reminded him of conversations with his departed companion about seasonal changes and the meanings they might express. Every architectural detail recalled shared moments of appreciation that could never be repeated or replaced. The magnificence that had once inspired him now served primarily as a source of painful nostalgia for irretrievable happiness. His development, which had begun during his years of exile, now deepened into serious consideration of complete renunciation. Buddhist teachings about the suffering inherent in all attachments acquired immediate relevance through his personal experience of loss and regret. The monastic life, which he had previously admired as an abstract ideal, began appearing as a practical solution to the emotional turmoil that worldly existence seemed to guarantee. Yet even this impulse toward withdrawal was complicated by responsibilities that made complete detachment impossible. His position within the imperial hierarchy created obligations to the sovereign and to the realm that could not be abandoned without causing significant disruption. His various children by different women required paternal guidance and material support that only he could provide. Most significantly, his very existence had become a cultural symbol that inspired achievement and refinement throughout Heian society. The compromise he eventually reached between transcendent aspiration and worldly duty reflected the mature wisdom that suffering had finally taught him. Rather than seeking dramatic gestures of renunciation that would satisfy his emotional needs while neglecting his responsibilities, he began living in the world, but not of it, fulfilling his obligations while maintaining the internal distance that Buddhist philosophy offered as the only reliable source of peace. His later compositions achieved a quality of profound melancholy that influenced generations of subsequent artists. These works expressed not the passionate intensity of his youth or the sophisticated refinement of his middle years, but a deeper understanding of existence that encompassed both magnificence and sorrow as aspects of a single reality. They spoke to readers across centuries because they captured universal truths about the nature of human experience that transcend particular historical circumstances. His relationships with others, including family members and long-term associates, took on qualities of compassionate distance that seemed to offer them more genuine support than his earlier intense involvements had provided. He became someone to whom people brought their troubles, because his responses combined practical wisdom with emotional understanding, freed from personal agenda or manipulative intention. The household he maintained during his final years reflected this transformation from passionate engagement to serene acceptance. Rooms that had once showcased magnificent collections of art and luxury objects now contained only essential items chosen for their functional value and philosophical significance. Gardens that had previously displayed elaborate artificial arrangements now emphasized natural processes of growth, decay, and renewal that mirrored the cycles of existence itself. Yet even this achieved wisdom could not entirely eliminate the human longings that had shaped his character since childhood. In quiet moments, especially during seasons that recalled his years with the Violet Lady, he experienced waves of regret and nostalgia that reminded him of how much happiness his inability to appreciate the present had cost him. These feelings served as continuing education in the Buddhist truths about suffering and attachment that intellectual understanding alone could never fully convey. The man who had begun life as a figure, touched by divine favor, ended it as someone who understood that all gifts, no matter how extraordinary, create both opportunities and obligations that must be navigated with wisdom acquired through experience rather than inherited through privilege. His story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of confusing cultural accomplishment within a development, and a testament to the possibility of finding meaning through accepting rather than transcending the limitations that define human existence. In his final years, when winter snow covered the gardens where he had once celebrated spring's return with his beloved companion, the luminous prince achieved the peace that had eluded him throughout his passionate youth and accomplished middle age. It was not the peace of having obtained everything he desired, but the deeper serenity that comes from understanding why such obtaining could never provide lasting satisfaction. This wisdom, purchased through decades of searching and loss, became his final gift to a world that had given him extraordinary magnificence, but required in return the equally extraordinary understanding that such gifts alone were never enough. The death of the luminous one marked not the end of his story, but its transformation into something both more complex and more tragic. His departure from the world, accomplished not through dramatic death, but through gradual withdrawal into contemplative silence, left behind a void that no single figure could fill. Yet from this absence emerged two young men whose lives would recapitulate the patterns of desire and disillusionment that had defined their predecessors' existence, while adding new dimensions of psychological complexity and philosophical depth. The circumstances surrounding these two figures reflected the intricate web of relationships and consequences that the Shining One's life had created. One was officially his son, born to a minor consort whose brief liaison had produced a child of extraordinary sensitivity and intelligence. The other was his grandson through imperial lineage, the offspring of a union that combined royal blood with the refined cultural traditions that the departed master had embodied and elevated. Yet beneath these official genealogies lay secrets that would complicate both young men's understanding of their own identities and their relationships with each other. The one called the fragrant youth, for his name meant perfume, carried within his very designation hints of mysteries that extended beyond ordinary human experience. From birth, he had emanated a natural scent that seemed to flow from his skin itself, a phenomenon that palace physicians could not explain through conventional medical knowledge. This supernatural characteristic suggested deeper truths about his parentage that only a few individuals understood. His mother's brief relationship with the luminous master had been preceded by another liaison, one involving a figure whose significance in the departed one's life had remained hidden beneath layers of discretion and carefully maintained appearances. The third princess married to the Shining Lord in his later years, through political arrangement rather than personal choice, had herself fallen victim to the same patterns of desire and betrayal that characterized her husband's earlier relationships. Her affair with Kashiwagi, a young nobleman whose own attraction to forbidden possibilities had led him into dangerous territory, had produced consequences that neither participant had anticipated. The child born from this union carried physical characteristics that made his true parentage obvious to those who knew what to observe, yet the timing and circumstances of his birth allowed for the preservation of public deceptions that protected all parties from scandal. The scented one thus grew to maturity, believing himself the son of the most celebrated figure of his age, while actually carrying the blood of someone whose life had been destroyed by the same compulsions that drove his supposed father's romantic adventures. This fundamental confusion about his own identity would shape every aspect of his character development, creating a young man torn between inherited tendencies toward passionate attachment and an intuitive understanding of the suffering that such bonds inevitably produced. His companion in the complex drama that would unfold was the imperial grandson, whose legitimate claim to descent from the luminous master was unquestionable, but whose character seemed to embody all of his grandfather's most troubling qualities, without the mitigating wisdom that experience had eventually brought. Where the fragrant youth was introspective and inclined toward philosophical speculation, the imperial descendant was impulsive and driven by immediate desires. Where the scented one questioned the value of worldly pleasures, the young nobleman pursued them with single-minded determination. The contrast between these two figures became apparent from their earliest childhood. The fragrant youth displayed an unusual capacity for solitary reflection and seemed genuinely interested in Buddhist teachings about the transitory nature of earthly existence. His tutors reported that he absorbed religious instruction with remarkable ease, while showing less enthusiasm for the competitive games and social activities that typically occupied noble children. The imperial grandson, by contrast, excelled in all the accomplishments that aristocratic culture valued most highly. His skill in music and verse surpassed that of instructors twice his age. His physical coordination and athletic abilities made him a natural leader in ceremonial activities and competitive sports. Most significantly, he possessed an instinctive understanding of social dynamics that allowed him to charm adults and dominate his peer group with apparently effortless success. Yet even these obvious differences could not entirely explain the complex dynamic that developed between them as they matured into young adulthood. Despite their contrasting temperaments, they were drawn to each other with an intensity that suggested deeper bonds than mere friendship or family connection. Each seemed to represent something the other lacked but secretly desired, the contemplative one envying his companion's confident engagement with immediate pleasures, while the passionate one was attracted to his friend's capacity for finding meaning in solitary reflection. Their relationship was further complicated by the knowledge, shared by both though never directly acknowledged, that they represented different aspects of the departed master's complex legacy. The fragrant youth embodied the philosophical development that had marked his supposed father's later years, while the imperial descendant incarnated the passionate intensity and aesthetic brilliance that had characterized his grandfather's youth. The first serious test of their friendship emerged when both young men encountered a family whose tragic circumstances would provide the setting for their most significant romantic adventures. In the remote district of Uji, where the Uji River flowed through landscapes that seemed untouched by the sophisticated corruptions of the imperial capital, lived the daughters of a nobleman whose own life had been shaped by connections to the luminous one's earlier years. These young women, the elder flower and the younger blossom, had grown to maturity in relative isolation from aristocratic society, receiving educations that emphasized classical learning and cultural refinement, while remaining innocent of the complex social manipulations that characterized noble life in Heian. Their father, before his death, had deliberately chosen this isolation as protection for daughters whose exceptional abilities and sensitivity might make them vulnerable to the kind of exploitation that palace life often visited upon accomplished women without powerful family protection. The discovery of these hidden treasures came about through the scented one's tendency towards solitary wandering and philosophical exploration. Unlike most young nobles of his generation, who preferred the predictable pleasures of established social circles, he found himself drawn to remote areas where he could pursue contemplative activities without the distractions of constant social obligation. His journeys to the Uji district, initially motivated by religious purposes and scholarly interests, brought him into contact with a household that seemed to embody ideals of refined simplicity that aristocratic life rarely achieved. The elder sister possessed qualities that recalled the most admirable characteristics of the women who had shaped the luminous master's emotional development. Her intelligence was matched by genuine wisdom about human nature. Her cultural accomplishments reflected deep understanding rather than mere technical proficiency. Most significantly, she displayed a natural dignity that seemed to arise from inner strength rather than social position or family connections. Her younger sister represented a different but equally compelling type of feminine excellence, where the elder impressed through thoughtful reserve and careful judgment, the younger enchanted through spontaneous responsiveness and emotional transparency. Her laughter came easily, her tears flowed without shame, and her reactions to experience revealed depths of feeling that sophisticated training often suppressed or distorted. The fragrant youth's initial encounters with this household stirred emotions he had never experienced before. His previous relationships with women had been limited to formal social interactions that followed prescribed patterns of courtship and conversation. The daughters of Uji represented something entirely different, the possibility of connections based on mutual understanding and shared values rather than conventional attractions and calculated advantages. Yet even this seemingly innocent beginning carried within it the seeds of future complications. The contemplative one's interest in the sisters inevitably became known to the imperial descendant, whose competitive nature made him unwilling to allow his friend to pursue any advantage without seeking to share or surpass it. His decision to involve himself in the Uji situation transformed what might have been a simple courtship into a complex triangle that would ultimately destroy the very qualities that had made the sisters attractive in the first place. The rivalry that developed between the two young men reflected deeper tensions about their respective positions in aristocratic society and their relationships to the legacy of the departed master. The scented one's philosophical inclinations and apparent indifference to worldly success had made some observers question whether he possessed the ambition and practical skills necessary for significant achievement. The passionate one's obvious talents and imperial lineage made him a natural focus for those who sought to align themselves with rising power. The sisters themselves responded to this situation with characteristic differences that revealed their individual natures, while demonstrating the impossible pressures that their circumstances created. The elder, recognizing the dangers that romantic involvement with either suitor would bring, attempted to maintain friendly but distant relationships that would preserve her family's dignity while avoiding the complications that passionate attachments inevitably produced. The younger, less experienced in the subtle cruelties that aristocratic society could inflict, and more responsive to immediate emotional appeals, found herself torn between genuine appreciation for both young men and growing awareness that her choices would have consequences extending far beyond her personal happiness. The crisis that would ultimately determine all their fates emerged from the fundamental incompatibility between the idealized expectations that both suitors brought to their courtship and the practical realities that governed the sisters' actual circumstances. The contemplative youth approached the relationship with philosophical assumptions about the possibility of pure connection that ignored the physical and social dimensions of romantic involvement. The imperial descendant pursued his attraction with characteristic intensity that overwhelmed the careful defenses the sisters had constructed to protect their independence and dignity. Neither approach could accommodate the complex needs and desires of young women who had been raised to value both intellectual accomplishment and emotional authenticity while lacking the worldly experience necessary to navigate the treacherous currents of noble courtship. The very isolation that had preserved their innocence also left them vulnerable to forms of manipulation and exploitation that more experienced women might have recognized and countered. The elder sister's response to these pressures demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of the philosophical education she had received. Her understanding of Buddhist teachings about the dangers of worldly attachment provided intellectual frameworks for analyzing her situation, but could not eliminate the human emotions that made complete detachment impossible to achieve. Her attempts to counsel both herself and her sister about the wisdom of avoiding romantic entanglements were undermined by her own recognition of the genuine attractions that both suitors possessed. The younger sister's struggle was even more poignant, as her naturally responsive temperament made her acutely sensitive to the emotional currents that surrounded her, while providing little guidance for managing the conflicts that arose when competing loyalties and desires could not be reconciled. Her appreciation for the fragrant youth's thoughtful consideration was complicated by her attraction to the imperial descendant's passionate intensity, while her desire to support her elder sister's wishes conflicted with her own needs for companionship and affection. The tragic resolution of these tensions came not through dramatic external intervention, but through the gradual accumulation of psychological pressures that neither sister could indefinitely sustain. The elderflower's health began declining in ways that recalled the mysterious illness that had claimed the Violet Lady decades earlier, as if the very effort of maintaining impossible emotional balances was slowly draining her life force. Her death, when it came, appeared to result from no specific cause that medical knowledge could identify. Yet everyone who knew her understood that she had essentially chosen to fade away rather than make choices that would compromise either her principles or her family's welfare. Her final compositions expressed both acceptance of her fate and profound regret for the suffering her departure would cause those who had sought happiness through connection with her. The loss of the elder blossom transformed the relationships among the three survivors in ways that none of them had anticipated. The scented one, faced with the destruction of his idealized vision of spiritual romance, was forced to confront the reality that even the most elevated emotions could become sources of suffering for their objects. The passionate youth, deprived of the competition that had intensified his own pursuit, discovered that victory achieved through his rival's withdrawal provided no satisfaction. Most tragically affected was the younger sister, who found herself bearing the emotional burden of her sibling's death while becoming the sole focus of attentions that had previously been divided between them. The intensity of interest from both young men, which might have been flattering under different circumstances, now served as a constant reminder of the price that romantic involvement had exacted from someone she had cherished more than her own life. The patterns that emerged from this tragedy would shape the final phase of the story that had begun with the luminous master's birth decades earlier. The next generation had inherited not only his extraordinary gifts, but also his capacity for transforming affection into suffering, magnificence into loss, and transcendent aspiration into worldly attachment that defeated its own highest purposes. Yet even this inheritance was not simply repetitive, for each generation brought new understanding to eternal human dilemmas. Where the departed one had eventually achieved wisdom through accepting the limitations of his own nature, his successors would face the challenge of learning similar lessons while dealing with complications that his legacy had created but not resolved. The young men who carried his blood and bore his influence would discover that knowledge of previous mistakes provided no immunity against repeating them, but might offer possibilities for deeper understanding of the forces that shape human destiny across generations. Their story would continue the exploration of desire and renunciation that had defined their predecessor's life, while adding new chapters to the eternal human struggle between worldly engagement and transcendent liberation. The death of the elder blossom cast a shadow over the Uji district that seemed to settle permanently into the landscape itself. The river that had once reflected autumn maples and spring cherry blossoms now appeared darker, its currents carrying whispers of loss that echoed through valleys where joy had once flourished. The very air grew heavy with unspoken grief, as if the natural world itself mourned the departure of someone whose presence had blessed everything around her. In the months following this tragedy, the surviving daughter found herself trapped in circumstances that grew more complex and painful with each passing season. The younger flower, once protected by her siblings' wisdom and guidance, now faced alone the competing attentions of two young men whose rivalry had intensified rather than diminished after their shared loss. The fragrant one's philosophical nature, which had previously expressed itself through respectful distance and contemplative appreciation, now took on qualities of obsessive brooding that made his presence as disturbing as it was devoted. His visits to the remote residence became more frequent and unpredictable, often occurring at hours when social convention discouraged casual calls. He would arrive unannounced, claiming urgent need for counsel or scholarly discussion, then spend hours gazing at spots where the departed one had once sat or walked. His conversations, while maintaining surface propriety, carried undertones of barely controlled feeling that made the younger Blossom increasingly uncomfortable with their growing intimacy. The imperial descendant's approach proved equally troubling, though in different ways. Where his competitor sought connection through shared grief and philosophical speculation, the ardent nobleman pursued his interests through displays of artistic accomplishment and social influence that demonstrated his superior position and resources. His gifts arrived with increasing frequency, rare incenses that perfumed the modest household for days, silk fabrics dyed in colors that captured the subtle beauty of seasonal changes, musical instruments crafted by master artisans whose work was normally reserved for imperial collections. These offerings, while individually appropriate and beautifully chosen, collectively created an atmosphere of obligation and expectation that the younger Blossom found increasingly difficult to navigate. Each gift required acknowledgement through carefully composed responses that balanced gratitude with discretion. Each gesture demanded reciprocal attention that drew her deeper into entanglements she had hoped to avoid. More troubling still was her growing awareness that both suitors saw in her not an individual whose own needs and desires mattered, but a replacement for the departed one whose death had left their aspirations unfulfilled. Their conversations frequently turned to memories of the elder, comparisons between the daughter's different qualities, and speculation about what the departed might have chosen had she lived to make the decisions that now fell to her survivor. This realization wounded the younger flower more deeply than outright neglect might have done, for it suggested that her primary value lay not in her unique characteristics, but in her family connection to someone whose loss had created a void that she was expected to fill. The very qualities that made her different from her departed sibling, her responsiveness, her spontaneous laughter, her capacity for finding joy in simple pleasures, seemed to be viewed as defects that needed correction rather than virtues worthy of appreciation. As autumn deepened into winter, the psychological pressures surrounding the household reached levels that threatened the surviving daughter's ability to maintain the dignified composure that her upbringing demanded. Sleep became elusive, interrupted by dreams that featured her departed sibling, offering cryptic warnings about dangers that approached in forms too subtle to recognize clearly. Her appetite diminished as food lost its appeal, replaced by a growing sense that physical nourishment could not address the emptiness that consumed her energy. The crisis that would transform this already difficult situation into something approaching tragedy emerged from an unexpected quarter. Among the retainers who served the household was a young woman whose own beauty and accomplishments had been overshadowed by the exceptional qualities of those she attended. Called Ukifune, meaning one who drifts like a boat without anchor, she possessed a delicate grace that recalled certain aspects of both departed figures while maintaining her own distinctive charm. Her origins were themselves a source of complexity, for she carried in her features hints of noble lineage that her current modest circumstances could not entirely conceal. Rumors suggested that her father had been someone of significant rank, whose death had left his unofficial offspring dependent upon the charity of relatives who acknowledged their obligations while resenting the burden they represented. The discovery of this hidden treasure came about through one of the ardent nobleman's visits to the residence, when circumstances arranged for him to glimpse the attendant during a moment when her usual discretion was relaxed. The sight of her face, partially revealed by a gust of wind that displaced her concealing fan, struck him with an intensity that recalled his grandfather's first encounters with feminine beauty that transcended ordinary human possibilities. Here was someone who seemed to embody all the qualities that had attracted him to the daughters, while being free from the complicated histories and associations that made pursuing them so fraught with difficulty. Her lower social position, rather than representing an obstacle, appeared to offer opportunities for the kind of adventure that aristocratic conventions usually made impossible. His investigation into her background revealed details that intensified rather than diminished his interest. The drifting one was indeed the daughter of a nobleman whose indiscretions had produced several unofficial children, each placed in circumstances that reflected their father's attempt to provide for them while avoiding the complications that formal recognition would have created. Her education, while modest compared to that of those she served, had been sufficient to develop her natural intelligence and artistic sensitivity to levels that surpassed those of many women of higher rank. Most significantly, she possessed a vulnerability that seemed to promise the kind of complete devotion that the imperial descendant had sought unsuccessfully in his previous pursuits. Her dependent position made resistance to his advances practically impossible, while her genuine appreciation for attention from someone of his exalted status suggested that his courtship would meet with enthusiastic rather than grudging acceptance. The affair that developed between them unfolded with a swiftness and intensity that recalled the most episodes from the luminous master's youth. Secret meetings, arranged through sympathetic intermediaries, allowed them to explore forms of intimacy that convention and circumstance had previously made impossible. The drifting one responded to his attentions with a wholehearted abandonment that surprised even the experienced seducer who had awakened her desires. Yet even this seemingly successful conquest carried within it complications that neither participant had anticipated. The ardent nobleman's involvement with the attendant inevitably became known to the fragrant one, whose own frustrated courtship of the younger daughter had left him particularly sensitive to any evidence of his competitor's success in related endeavors. The knowledge that his companion had found satisfaction through pursuing someone connected to the very household, where his own hopes had been disappointed, wounded him more deeply than outright betrayal might have done. His response to this situation revealed aspects of his character that previous circumstances had left undeveloped. The philosophical detachment that had marked his approach to worldly affairs gave way to intensity that surprised those who had assumed his inclinations made him immune to ordinary jealousies and competitive impulses. His determination to secure what he saw as his rightful share of fulfillment led him to pursue the attendant with methods that combined intellectual sophistication with manipulative calculation. The young woman found herself caught between competing claims that she could neither fully understand nor successfully navigate. The imperial descendant's ardent intensity offered experiences of physical and connection that her isolated upbringing had never allowed her to imagine. The fragrant one's thoughtful consideration provided intellectual stimulation and philosophical guidance that appealed to aspects of her nature that more direct approaches could not reach. Neither suitor could offer the kind of stable, respectable union that would secure her social position and long-term welfare. Both represented forms of adventure that promised immediate satisfaction, while threatening future disgrace and abandonment. Her choice between them, or her attempt to maintain connections with both, would necessarily involve deceptions and betrayals that violated the principles of honesty and loyalty that her education had emphasized as essential to admirable character. The resolution of this impossible situation came not through rational decision-making, but through the accumulation of pressures that overwhelmed the drifting one's capacity for clear judgment. The constant need to balance competing demands while concealing the true nature of her involvements created psychological strains that manifested in physical symptoms, resembling those that had preceded the elder daughter's decline. Her sleep became troubled by dreams that featured the departed blossom, warning her about dangers that approached in forms too subtle to recognize or avoid. Her appetite disappeared as physical pleasures lost their appeal, replaced by growing awareness that worldly satisfactions could not provide the peace that her spirit craved. Most troubling, she began experiencing moments of dissociation when her sense of personal identity seemed to dissolve, leaving her feeling like a character in someone else's story rather than the author of her own choices. The crisis reached its climax during a late autumn evening when the two competitors encountered each other at the residence under circumstances that made their rivalry impossible to disguise or ignore. Both had arrived expecting private meetings with the attendant, neither aware that his counterpart had made similar arrangements for the same time. The confrontation that resulted revealed the full extent of the deceptions that had been necessary to maintain their triangular involvement. The imperial descendant's anger at discovering his opponent's participation combined wounded pride with genuine pain in ways that made rational discussion impossible. His accusations of betrayal and manipulation reflected not only his disappointment at sharing what he had believed was exclusive possession, but his deeper recognition that the satisfaction he had sought was ultimately as illusory as his previous pursuits had proven. The Fragrant One's response demonstrated that his philosophical training had not eliminated his capacity for destructive feeling, but had simply provided him with more sophisticated methods for expressing and justifying his grievances. His calm analysis of the situation's moral implications carried undertones of condemnation that were more wounding than direct insults would have been. The Drifting One, forced to witness this confrontation between figures whose attention had previously seemed like blessings, finally understood the true nature of the trap her circumstances had created. Neither man saw in her an individual whose welfare mattered for its own sake, but rather a prize whose possession would demonstrate superiority over his opponent. Their competing claims treated her as property to be acquired, rather than a person whose feelings and desires deserved consideration. This recognition precipitated a psychological crisis that manifested in the most dramatic action of her life. Rather than choose between alternatives that offered no genuine satisfaction, or continue enduring the turmoil that their competition imposed upon her, she made a decision that stunned everyone who knew her. On a night when winter storms lashed the district with unusual violence, she disappeared from the household that had become her prison, leaving behind only a note that expressed her determination to seek peace through complete withdrawal from the world that had brought her nothing but suffering. Her attempted suicide, for that was clearly what her flight into the storm-lashed river represented, was prevented only by the intervention of a fisherman whose boat happened to be seeking shelter in the exact location where the current had carried her unconscious form. Her rescue, which seemed miraculous to those who learned of it, initiated the final phase of her story and the ultimate resolution of the conflicts that had destroyed so many lives. The near-death experience transformed the Drifting One in ways that made resuming her previous existence impossible. When she regained consciousness, she claimed to remember nothing of her past life or the circumstances that had led to her desperate action. Whether this amnesia was genuine or feigned, it provided her with the opportunity to begin again, free from the entanglements that had made happiness impossible. Her recovery took place in a remote religious establishment, where the abbess who supervised her care was wise enough to recognize the young woman's need for guidance as well as physical healing. The contemplative life that the former attendant embraced during this period provided forms of peace and purpose that her previous adventures had never offered. The disciplined routines of religious practice, the supportive community of women who had chosen similar paths, and the philosophical framework that gave meaning to renunciation combined to create circumstances where genuine healing could occur. The two competitors, learning of her survival and transformation, responded in ways that revealed the fundamental differences in their characters that their rivalry had obscured. The ardent nobleman, faced with evidence that his pursuit had nearly destroyed its object, began questioning the value of desires that could produce such devastating consequences. His grief over what he had almost caused led him toward explorations that gradually replaced his obsessions with genuine religious commitment. The Fragrant One's reaction was more complex, combining relief at her survival with frustration at being denied the resolution he had sought. His philosophical nature enabled him to understand intellectually that her withdrawal represented wisdom rather than defeat. Yet his attachment to the outcome made acceptance of her choice extraordinarily difficult. The final chapter of their intertwined stories unfolded when both young men attempted to visit the religious establishment where the former attendant had found sanctuary. Their pilgrimage to the remote location, undertaken separately but motivated by similar needs for closure and understanding, brought them face to face with the consequences of their competition and the limitations of their respective approaches to fulfillment. The woman they encountered during these visits bore little resemblance to the vulnerable figure they had pursued so destructively. The Drifting One's transformation through practice had given her a serenity and strength that made their previous treatment of her seem even more deplorable in retrospect. Her gentle but firm refusal to resume connections that had caused such suffering provided both visitors with final lessons about the nature of genuine renunciation and the peace that comes from accepting rather than pursuing what cannot be possessed. The wind in the pines that gave this chapter of the story, its name carried away the last echoes of pursuit and competitive desire that had driven the narrative since the Luminous Master's youth. In their place settled a deeper understanding of impermanence and the futility of seeking lasting satisfaction through temporary pleasures. The former attendant had found her peace through abandoning the world that had brought her only suffering, while her former suitors were left to discover whether wisdom acquired through witnessing such extremes of renunciation could guide them toward more sustainable approaches to the eternal human struggle between desire and contentment.